Welcome to another episode of the Vikingology podcast. I'm co-host number one, CJ Adrian.
And I am co-host number two, Terry Barnes. And we are, as always, the art and science of the Viking Age. And as our audience will know, if they've been listening to us for any length of time, excuse me, see, coffee hasn't kicked in yet. We like to approach the Viking Age from a lot of different angles, and we've had a lot of scholars in the field on this show. We've had people who write historical fiction, like CJ does. We've had people who do role-playing games. We're going to talk to some people about magic in a couple of weeks, but today we're going to do a totally different thing, and we're going to talk about both the past and the present as far as contemporary issues related to things that at least partially stem from the Viking Age and aspects of it. And so we have today Ross Downing, and he is a scholar who actually, interestingly, Ross, I think we have the same PhD supervisor at the University of the Highlands and Islands in Scotland. So you have a master's
Small
degree
world.
there. Yeah, in Old Norse cosmology and theology, and then also another master's degree from University of Gothenburg, which is also related to paganism. So we're going to be talking a lot about then the Viking Age and the pre-Christian period today, and the sort of ideas and beliefs and things that come ostensibly from that period of time, but then get kind of remixed and reinterpreted in the modern era in various ways, both in modern paganism in an inclusionary way, but also, of course, as everyone knows, if you pay attention to the news at all, extremists who also sometimes latch on to that part of the Viking Age history. And then as part of this as well, so not only the scholarly part, but you've been a researcher and a security analyst with regard to this topic. And also, you have a background in crime prevention and working with young people as far as rehabilitating them, and also working for the Defense Academy of the UK. So, and you have a lot of work have been specific to the UK with organizations there and stuff. But obviously, the book that we're going to be talking about that was just published, and look, I'm already like marking it up and lots of tabs, but about Germanic and Slavic paganisms, security threats and resiliency that, it is also geared towards, well, we'll say, quote unquote, the West, right? As far as the United States, Canada, Australia, other places in the world, and increasingly, places outside of that as well. So, anyway, welcome to Vikingology, Ross.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's good to
Yeah.
be here. And
This
I'm
is
really pleased that you got the book in time as well, because it's not most of the contributors to the book got their copy or copies of the book before I did. So that was exciting.
Wow, that's a good publisher, Ross.
Well, yeah, I was getting a bit paranoid. I thought maybe I'd, given them some bad vibes and they cancelled me or something like that. So I wasn't going to get any, but they kept on. The thing is, I didn't just get one set of books either. I got the first package, and then they sent me another package, and then I got another package, and it kept coming. Instead of sending them all in one go. So yeah, now I've got some books anyway.
Well, thank you
It's the
for
main thing.
sending us or having them send us our copies. Really interesting stuff. And as a matter of fact, I just went through my library at the college that where I'm teaching, and they have a way of ordering a digital chapter if you want to have students just be able to get access to a part of it so that I could assign the introduction, because I think the introduction is real. Did you write it? I don't know. It doesn't really indicate who wrote it.
Yeah, so all the editorial parts is me and technically Karina, my co-editor as well. But certain sections we've in personally more interested or more specialized in certain areas. So some introduction sections of the book. So there's the introduction chapter, and then there's three sections to the book, and each one of those sections has an introductory section that we've written. And there's a conclusion chapter. So each introduction section, some parts of them will be, more written by one of us than the other. So Karina specializes in Slavic neo-paganism, specifically Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Belarus. that kind of thing. She's got some really amazing academic anthologies that I recommend that people look into. And with it being Slavic paganism, that often isn't something that crops up when people look at Vikings. But if you look at and this is the reason why it's in our book, is that Slavic neo-paganism also sees itself as directly connected to Viking mythology. It's just that they see it in terms of Slavic culture and Slavic heritage, and that generally all revolves around this narrative of the Kievan Rus. So both Ukraine and Russia and Belarus, for instance, all see themselves as inheritors of the legacy of Kievan Rus, and that is literally this hybrid of Nordic Vikings with local Slavs. Hence
Yeah,
the book being Germanic and Slavic.
so the history for, I think maybe a lot of our audience will know, but for those who don't, the history of this polity known as the Kievan Rus, as the primary chronicle anyway, tells the story, comes about in the early 860s, and having Varangians, or people probably of Swedish Rus descent, Vikings in the east, as you say, for a shortcut, who basically, yeah, set up a polity there and then begin kind of assimilating on some level, kind of not on others. But then there is this long-standing debate, at least in the scholarly community, so the Normanists and the anti-Normanists, sort of what is the foundation there as far as the cultural heritage is it Scandinavian or is it Slavic? So there's a real mix there, but that's what we're talking about when we say the Kievan Rus. So, I mean, I want to back up to say this, like how, you got interested in this subject and this type of work, but also because you have a degree in Old Norse cosmology and theology that, because we're going to refer to sort of paganisms a lot here, that maybe you could just give just a kind of a little bit of a background about like, what does that mean for you? I mean, what is that worldview that's back there that people are, increasingly kind of trying to latch onto now?
Yeah, well, definitions is a good place to start. I mean, the any definition that you use is going to be shorthand for something and will not always be accurate in different contexts. So, generally speaking, when I now will be talking about paganisms, I'll be talking about what some people will call neo-paganisms, and specifically the strands of paganism, like I say, based on Germanic and Slavic mythologies. But really, paganism is used as a single term quite frequently today, or neo-paganism, as if anybody that is interested in old religions or identifies with these old religions and old mythologies, as if it's all one religion, and it isn't. So that that's my caveat before I go down that road of using paganism as a single term, because it could be misleading, and obviously I don't want to mislead. And I think it's important also to differentiate between the modern paganism and what people will often term paganism when they talk about these old religions. And I think when I've certainly dealt with this question in the study of Old Norse religion, using the term like paganism is not really effective or useful. It is if you're talking to people outside of the subject, because people will know what you mean. But if you're talking to other scholars who are looking at this material and you were to use a term like paganism, that's a projection, that's a modern English term. And it doesn't really help when you're talking about a period and the geographical areas and material and all these societies that were even one particular society was a mixed society with different religious interests. And it's probably not even useful to talk about Christian or pre-Christian or non-Christian, because a lot of the archaeological material in a lot of these contexts in the late Scandinavian Iron Age seems to be syncretic, so hybrid. So more like both rather than one or the other. And that's fascinating. And that isn't a narrative that seems to have caught on in modern times, certainly not in mainstream society. and certainly not amongst neo-pagans. They do see things in black and white terms because their modern identity is, well, I'm not a Christian. I follow this old religion. Therefore, these are the people in the past that I identify with. It's a cognitive bias. They'll filter out the things that they don't want to see, and any bit of paganism that they'll say, well, that's fully pagan, and they won't consider, well, maybe it was kind of post-Christian paganism or reinvented paganism or another wave of paganism. So what I work with often is the narratives that we have both as academics and as mainstream society and as neo-paganism pagans see the world, and also how the far right sees the world through the how we relate to our heritage or what we claim to be our heritage.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Right away in the introduction of your book, you talk about or suggest that most of these modern movements are not based in anything historical that we would consider historical.
Yeah.
And my personal experience has been, now I run in circles where I interact with people with an interest in the Viking Age and Viking history. That includes a lot of folks who are part of some of these movements. And I have found, just on my personal experience, is a lot of times I get the sense that they're doing so, adopting these things in opposition to Christianity,
Yeah.
almost in revolt of the religion that they grew up with. And what you're
Yeah.
suggesting is, the reality, again, they're ignoring the reality of that blend. It was a long period of time, and we've spoken with some folks that specialize in the Christianization of Scandinavia, and it didn't happen overnight. You had the first proselytizing monks like Ansgar, who was in the 820s, all the way through to I think there were still pockets of old religion in Sweden until what, the 1700s. So
Yeah.
it
Technically,
didn't
yeah.
just happen. It was a long trend. So can you speak to that as far as in your work, like how much of it
Yeah.
is an opposition, how much of it is kind of like a rebellion, how much of it how much of it is a youthful movement versus older folks?
That's a good. There's several good points there. Firstly, I think it would be disingenuous and unfair if I was to say that pagans are all, misguided and uneducated. However, and I think a lot of pagans are aware of this. I wouldn't even say that they're aware. It's central to the discourse in these communities about self-education. And so there's this constant debate and reflection over, well, maybe the academics don't really know what they're talking about, or this is a really good academic text, they'll say, and they'll share it, but it's an academic text from the 20s or the 40s or something like that. And you might try to speak to that person then and say, well, that's not really an academic text because that's not relevant to what we now, our body of academic knowledge as it is today. And they might respond and say, well, who do you think you are? You're not a professor, and etc. Right? And that's really a good point. But the point is that when people try to self-educate, depending on their level of education and their means to be reviewed, like to have their knowledge reviewed, because knowledge is a debate and it needs to be constantly checked and updated and developed and to be twisted and turned to be seen from different points of view. When you can't really do that in a religious community, especially when people have got kids and jobs, and maybe they don't have great higher education, or maybe they do, and maybe that's giving them some kind of cognitive bias that, well, I did a BA in history 20 years ago, so I know how to think critically. Not everybody who, even in the study of Old Norse religion, you've got academics who have some quite difficult views of history, and they are often at loggerheads with their colleagues in academia. That's one of the great things about academia, right? It's supposed to be debate, it's supposed to be peer review, but that system in doesn't really exist in neo-paganism, which is one of the conclusions that we make in the book, that in order for the pagan community to be more resilient from these loud voices and very influential people in the community who are channeling and maybe twisting and overbearing and controlling sources and gatekeeping and that kind of thing. In order to change that status quo, we perhaps need to encourage pagans, certainly Germanic pagans, heathens as a true are, to get more organized across the board, just like other religions do, so that there are more checks and balances and more academic education on clergy, because that doesn't exist, and that's one of the reasons why it continues to be vulnerable to, as you say, this kind of a more emphasis perhaps on identity politics. And one of the identities involved there is, well, I'm not a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the pagans that I speak to are aware of that. They're also, some of them will be, one of the very common things that comes up when I start to do field work with someone who's pagan, and I start to delve into, how it feels to be a pagan and their experiences. One of the things they will say, well, everybody thinks I'm a witch or a Satanist or a Nazi, and I'm not. I'm this, and that's quite often how this conversation will start.
So, CJ and I have talked about this a lot on the podcast with regard to modern conceptions, whether they're preconceptions, misconceptions, whatever, about Vikings, really having its roots in the 19th century, as far as, all of that. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to assign your chapter, there's many, but I think you do a really good job of providing the background history. And especially because I teach sort of more geared towards the Western stuff, but so you separate out the Germanic paganism from the Slavic, but the Germanic stuff and coming from like these folkish movements in the 19th century and then coming up through the 20th century and all of that history. And so I think I would be interested in having like to lay that out as well, because there's I think you do a really good job of like, okay, what's the problem with folkish? And then this thing that happens in people's mind of like, oh, it's just folklore, it's just folk songs or whatever, and it's like, no, it's actually kind of more dangerous than that. And so can you talk about that just a little bit, as far as like a lot of this being rooted in the 19th century, and then, coming forward into the 20th century? I mean, as I understand it too, I mean, a lot of the sort of neo-pagan, sort of heathen or Ausatur or whatever, I mean, really doesn't start getting a ton of traction until you probably get into what, like the 60s and 70s? In the 1960s and 70s. And so, by that point, there's a century of, this history from this kind of Germanic folkish stuff. So talk a little bit about that, like you do in the book, as far as the difference between like, what is the difference between like folkish and folklore or heritage or whatever? And then why is one maybe considered a little bit more dangerous than the other?
Well, to back up a little bit, so briefly, for people that aren't aware of when a lot of this material came out, so you've got archaeological material and then you've got textual material. And the Old Norse mythology texts and things like Beowulf and even histories like Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a lot of those texts just didn't exist in modern languages. They weren't, a lot of those languages weren't understood. Old English wasn't really understood properly until the 1800s. And certainly, a lot of people, normal people, couldn't read about that. So it was only really in the late Victorian period in Britain where young people were growing up reading about Anglo-Saxons and Vikings and all these stories and mythology. British people just didn't, and Scandinavians didn't really have access to that kind of material. And then on the other hand, you've got archaeological discoveries which had been made, and obviously people were aware of rune stones and things like that in Scandinavia. But in the 1800s specifically, you get some really amazing Bronze Age and Iron Age, but mainly Bronze Age finds in Denmark that people become aware at the same time as these texts are becoming mass produced into modern languages, that, okay, I think we're looking at the same kinds of things here. And that's generally where the idea of the horned helmet comes from. So you've got, specifically in Denmark and in Anglo-Saxon England, you have a lot of figurines from the very early Iron Age and late Bronze Age which now the theory is that it's possibly something connected to the coat of Woden. So you have some kind of half-naked figure with what looks like horns, but they're actually two birds, presumably ravens' heads meeting. And it's possible that it's supposed to be both, like kind of horns and, but anyway. So that's the world where the first part of history where people in Europe, or white people, if you like, start to become aware of, okay, this is where we come from, and this is a religious world. And a lot of these elements probably are still around us in folklore, etc. Right? But words like folklore didn't really exist. That was also something that was, you're trying to put words to things. So that whole period is what we call the Romantic nationalist period. So it's the invention of a lot of modern states, specifically in Europe. And what's happening there is you've got, say, if we take Britain as an example, you've got all these different ethnic groups, language groups, and even religious groups, and you're putting them into a united kingdom. And what do you do then? How do you relate to a kind of common history and common identity? So that's one of the reasons, one of the motivations why Tolkien did what he did. He wanted to create this hybrid hodgepodge of Celtic and Finnish and Germanic mythologies all together. So keeping in mind when Tolkien was around as well, and he was an expert, he was an academic, and that created the fantasy genre, although it did exist before. But I think it's fair to say Tolkien kind of was a big milestone there. So what was happening publicly was this sense of identity with, as I say, with language groups and cultural history and ethnic groups. In Scandinavia, Britain, or certainly England, and then the German-speaking areas, because Germany didn't really exist, you had these three areas where people were using that, specifically the religious ideas about the religious past, the pagan or pre-Christian past, as this is where we come from. So they didn't really see themselves as like, from the Stone Age or descended from monkeys or anything like that. It was almost like as far back as we can go, we were these Vikings, basically, right? And that's why if you look at Wagner and all the traditions in the very old opera regalia that they wore, it's all feathered helmets and, spiky Xena warrior princess bras and all that kind of stuff, right? So these very outdated ideas and visuals, and a lot of that in some ways still persists today. So if you look at like the Norseman, the film with Alexander Skarsgård, it's pretty good. They've nailed quite a lot of some really good visuals there. But even in that, they've got this winged helmet. There's a Valkyrie with a winged helmet. In the Viking TV series, okay, that's not a great example because there's a lot of problems in that. But they also have a religious figure. I think it's in series 1, stands out on a pier in a fjord, and she's got like this feathered helmet on as well. And I don't know where that comes from because I'm pretty sure there's no archaeology of feathered helmets or depictions of it, but that's just the way it was interpreted. And so what I'm trying to say is our modern views of this ancient past, and when we recreate it and we try to communicate that, whether it be through politics or through Wagner or through a film or whatever, or the cover work from a metal band, you're using Victorian misunderstandings about the past. And that's also where modern paganism kind of comes from, actually. It comes from that same place. So the first modern pagans we see, specifically in the German and the Slavic context, were also ethno-nationalists, and they read maybe a little bit of a mythology book, and then they wrote their own book about what they thought about the world. And sometimes that would involve what they thought about the Jews and all of this kind of stuff, right? And then there's a big shift after the Second World War. So people don't talk about those kinds of things anymore for obvious reasons. And then you get this new generation that comes up, as you say, really it's 1972, seems to be like the golden year there. there's several countries start these Asatru or heathen Odinist Germanic pagan groups. And the majority of them were in English-speaking countries, and the majority of them were far right. The Slavic pagan groups, again, they were focused on Vikings and the Kievan Rus and Norse mythology. They baked that into their Slavic mythology. Modern pagans didn't evolve in those countries until after the end of the Soviet era. And what happens there is in Slavic countries, you get a backlash to Russian imperialism. So in each of these nations, like Poland and Ukraine and etc., it becomes automatically nationalist and isolationist. So, how do you express or signal that you're very anti-Soviet and very, very Polish? Well, you might start to flirt a little bit with neo-Nazism or those kinds of symbols. And then it gets really complicated because the Poles have this very obviously very difficult relationship with with Germans historically, but also with neo-Nazis, what happened in the Second World War. So you got all these like splinter groups and very difficult politics. And that's the history in Eastern Europe. And then obviously in the West and America and Australia as well. That has the first modern heathen groups, you could say, began in Australia. So all the English-speaking world has that connection that runs directly on from the National Romantic period.
So then what is folkish? Where does that come in?
So folkish is a modern English word that comes from the German word Völkisch, and so the same root word exists in all the Germanic languages, as far as I'm aware, is folk, which just means people. And in the 1800s, early 1900s, folk, to talk about people, is not a big issue. They didn't realize what was going to happen in the 1930s and 40s when you start talking about Germanic pride, Germanic folk, the Germanic folk soul. That was a term that the Germans used, right? They didn't know where that was going to lead. So the word folk in English was applied to like folk songs and folklore and folk dress and things. And it never really, even today, if you talk about folk music in the UK or in America, it doesn't really have any political overtones. But Volkisch, certainly in Germany today, is used almost in common parlance in politics to talk about anything that emphasizes Germanic Blut und Boden, like the soil and belonging to the land by blood and having native rights over that land. That's basically where Volkisch comes from. So today we have a whole slew of a whole denomination, if you like, of certainly Germanic pagans, heathens that call themselves Volkisch, and they specifically refer to that German idea of the 20s and 30s, which is Volkisch, which again is that you inherit your religion through genetics. So that gets a little bit complicated where you're in countries like Australia or America, where to be a white person doesn't necessarily mean that you've got Anglo-Saxon or even West European blood, right? So you have one particular character I won't name, who's a leader of an American heathen organization who did a lot of work, public publications about folkish paganism, and he specifically talks about, well, it doesn't really matter if you're descended from the Celts because they're basically the same people as the Germanic pagans, our Viking ancestors. So it's enough if you're white and European, you have a right to worship the Norse gods. So there's quite a lot of mental gymnastics that goes on there in order to make this Volkish or folkish thing work. If you're going to apply that logic, that reasoning that your religion is something in your blood. Because, even if you do a DNA test, then all these questions come up, right? I mean, we've been Christians for over 1,000 years, most of us in Europe. So is that in our blood now, or where do you draw the line?
I wonder if he encountered the origins of the word German, which is the Latin Germanus, which is what I say it very French, don't I? Which is what
well, you are French.
That's what the Romans called these other people that were were in close proximity to the Celts. And so I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Germanus actually means like cousin. And it's just like in French today, your first cousin is a cousin germain, right? So it's like very close relative. And maybe they encountered that, thought, oh well, if you're good enough. But then I mean, why only go that far? And why not like turn the clock back to say Cheddar Man, who was black, and say, well, you could be any color and be a heathen, right? Like
Yeah.
because if you rewind the clock far enough, we're all related to the same people, no matter where.
Not, but this is it. They can't handle that. So
Yeah.
they've got an answer for that. They have, so that's woke. So the cheddar man, and are having black ancestors or darker skinned ancestors in Europe is a conspiracy. It's not true. They're trying to take our whiteness away from us, right? That's how they would answer them.
Mm.
So it becomes the view of history and the view of, certainly when you identify with history and you make it your whole world view, your whole cosmology, it permeates everything that you think about. And certainly in terms of politics, you can be very selective about how you handle facts and information. And we see that obviously across the board in disinformation and alternative facts and fake news. It's not just a case of Vikings and Cheddar Man here. We're talking about, this is the nature of our society now and how we communicate.
All right, so I'm going to throw something at you now, and feel free to laugh. It's meant to be kind of funny, but also just haha. But if you think about where we started, which is the Christianization of Scandinavia, which appears to have been this long, kind of slow process, and then it wasn't. We just became Christian. It's oh, we became Christian. We kept all these things, and so they picked and chose what worked for them at that time. So are these people who are picking and choosing the historical narrative really embodying the spirit of those early late Iron Age Scandinavians in terms of how they're formulating their belief systems?
Yeah.
I'm
So
kidding.
this is okay. I'd
No,
love
I think
I'd
that's
love
a
to have.
that's a
Go on.
sorry, go ahead.
Well, these kinds of debates and the rhetoric and the uh, logic, using logic and rationale to have conversations about things that are based on, because religion is at a everyone is emotionally attached to their religion or their religious or spiritual beliefs. So and most religions do have a historical aspect to them, even Christianity. Soon as you start challenging somebody's view of history or debating, then it becomes a very personal matter. So yeah, I would love to see you, CJ, have a conversation with some of these people that I interact with. I think it
I,
could
I
be good fun.
I have had the pleasure, and I've also had the pleasure of what's the Dungeons and Dragons word? Misty stepping the F out of there because I've gotten myself into trouble before. Where I ask pointed
Yeah,
questions that challenge their belief systems just to see how
yeah,
it sticks. And my experience, I live in Bend, Oregon. We have neo-Nazi groups, we have neo-pagan groups, we have in fact, there's this wild story from a few years ago where just east of town, where I'm living right now, there was I wouldn't they were on the list for the FBI to keep an eye on, right? They had a compound, they had slaves, they had people that were there that were forced labor and so forth. It's a large group, and I believe they're still there. I mean, if you go by, I think there's a pirate flag out in front. It's wild. But anyway, so these are people who kind of do that, and they come into town every so often. And I've encountered a few of them. They have like the Mjolnir tattoos and the Valknut, which I have here somewhere, which I don't know. This was all just fun decorations. I don't believe any of this. But for those of you who are listening to the podcast just with your ears, I'm pointing at the tapestries that I have in my background for that. But I've had conversations with these people, and it's really fascinating to kind of get into their heads, but also these are inherently violent people who threaten to kill you very quickly. And so, anyway, go back to the story. We have the neo-Nazis east of town. And this happened. When did it happen? It was when I was in high school, right after 9/11. And a big piece of property east of town was purchased by an unknown purchaser. And next thing you know, there's like an Al Qaeda training camp out there. And the neo-Nazis noticed it and called it into the FBI. And boy, would I have loved to have been a fly on the wall of that room of the FBI agent who's like, here's my homegrown terrorist group that I've been watching for 20 years who carry out. I believe they're the ones who burned a cross on Pilot Butte back, I think, in '89, as recently as '89. Anyway, I could be slightly off on all this stuff, so anyone fact checking, I might be. It's I'm close to the truth here. I'm just going from memory. But anyway, to be a fly on the wall of that room of the FBI agent taking the call and hearing, "Hi, this is so and so from this compound." Oh, okay. Hi, how can I help you? There's an Al Qaeda base on the property next door. Can you imagine the FBI agent who's just what? Not and of course these are inherently racist people. So it's like, are you sure it's not just like a Latino family that just moved in? You know, like that. But anyway, they found out that that land had been purchased by somebody who supported is either Al Qaeda or one of the other groups. And so just one of those wild stories. But anyway, back to
Yeah,
the whole
absolutely.
having a conversation with these people. I have gotten
Oh,
myself into trouble where I have feared for my corporal integrity. Um, I'm not a fan of unscheduled disassemblies.
well, there's also an emotional element to a lot of people that I talk to. So yeah, I mean, mo most of my work is to help document and record, and that will then perhaps be used to help educate people on how to differentiate between people that have far right or extreme or hostile views and use paganism or appropriate cultural heritage, and to differentiate them from, fluffy bunny pagan people who just want to get on and do their thing. So there's always that, as I say, an emotional element when you talk to people about their religion and their worldview and their politics. And for a lot of pagans, it's a source of great distress for them that they are misunderstood and that maybe they themselves are being influenced by these people, these bad actors that come into their religious communities. It creates paranoia and upsets, it splits organizations and all that kind of thing. So as a anthropologist or as someone who does interviews and things, you need to be very very careful that you don't get dragged in, especially if everyone has ethics and you also have your own religion and you have your own political viewpoints. And it obviously, when you speak to people who are extremists, or hateful or uh, white separatist or variations of that, you really have to be very careful, not only in the questions that you ask, but how you record the data that you're getting. So obviously, when you record, an audio, make an audio recording, then it's fairly easy to not misinterpret someone. But one of the problems of being an ethnologist or an anthropologist, sociologist, is that you often leading a conversation, right? I mean, that's what all conversations are, and in ways that you don't consciously, you know, consciously aware of. So you're always trying to reflect about, where is this? Where am I? What am I doing? How am I affecting this person? And to go back to your point actually about this odd situation of the far right and the jihadists, really that's something that is quite there's a recent development now, and I'd say perhaps in the last 2 years specifically, where things have got very, very mixed up. And there are lots of surprising relationships between um, political, ethnic, religious groups that we didn't see before that seem to be quite confusing because we're using old definitions. And perhaps because the people involved, so a far right extremist who's interested in paganism, will use identifications and symbols and communications based on, say, like the Nazis. So you expect them to think like a neo-Nazi, but really they support Israel. So then you have this whole weird situation where you've got a neo-Nazi who's supporting Israel because his real enemies, the way he sees it today, is the Muslim immigrants in his country. So he's pro-Israel. And maybe he's also not just pagan, but he's also kind of trad Christian. So he also feels that Jews or Zionists are also kind of allied to him in some ways because they share Judeo-Christian conservative values. So things can get really, really confusing very quickly these days, just in specifically the last 2 years. So the UK has, generally speaking, three categories of security when they try to categorize somebody who's potential terrorist or extremist. So that's jihad, far right, and then mixed, unclear, and unstable. And that category, mixed, unclear, and unstable, has just shot through the roof now. And it's also the question is whether it's even useful to talk about ideology anymore, because it's perhaps so personal. We start using terms like targeted violence instead. So yeah, there's a lot of what you might say crazy things happening because you see people that you identify as crazy, but in their world, they have very logical, emotionally charged ideas about the world and history and other people and how the world should be.
Yeah,
I
I'm
think,
always.
oh,
Oh, go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Terry.
I think an interesting aspect of this is as I'm listening to you talk, and it's sort of sounding like, sort of the mental gymnastics that you said, and then you also do talk in the book about, the I don't know how to say, like the relative kind of slipperiness with language that they use to sort of obfuscate and things like that. But also the sense of just kind of, cherry picking the past, right? And that is not new. Cherry picking the past or writing and rewriting history or controlling the narrative or propaganda or however you want to phrase a lot of this. I mean, that's, humans have been doing that since humans have been humans, basically, right? And I think we sort of call it out now because we live in a world where we sort of, at least on some level, I think, and maybe this is a post-scientific revolution kind of worldview or something, I'm not exactly sure, but it's like we sort of latch onto this idea of objective truth and that it's not about just sort of picking this and that to suit what you want it to be, and then that's truth. Although now it's getting a little blurry. I know at least here in the United States, there's a lot of talk of like, oh, well, but my truth is my truth and it's about my lived experience. So it does become very subjective and not objective. And so I think, sort of this manipulating and playing with the past in order to suit one's own agenda or purpose or narrative or whatever. I mean, this isn't something that's new, but I think like what you just said there at the end about the increase in this kind of mixed or whatever, that the internet has to play an incredibly sort of wild card role in this, doesn't it? Because, here we're doing something, or these people are doing something that people have always done, except for now the intensity of it, because it can become very personal and impersonal at the same time because of the internet, right? And so it just atomizes and like all these little sort of ticking time bombs, like pun intended, out there, like who knows where, because it's the internet, in all these little pockets and
Right.
corners of stuff. So yeah, can you
Yeah.
speak to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, and where we got real data on that, I mean, the whole world saw that in action on the COVID. So then we realized, like, the internet is great for communication, but if you're isolated and maybe you're not feeling too great, your mental health is going south, then now that communication is a wind tunnel of being influenced, receiving disinformation. So we had a massive issues with radicalization, right, under COVID. Young people, suicide amongst young people, that whole incel movement. You've got a whole generation of young people who have lost a normal period of their mental and emotional and social development. They couldn't meet their friends. They, didn't get to have their first kiss at perhaps a normal age. So now you've got all these socially awkward and sexually awkward young people in their 20s because they went through this period of isolation in COVID. And the big thing with the internet and with news and media and all these things that are going around is narratives all the time. So people aren't digesting information in the same way. People used to read books and papers, newspapers and things, or even listen to the radio or watch TV. Now people are just getting these short hits, or literally shorts on YouTube, right? TikTok, all that kind of stuff. So the only thing that you can really convey in that kind of content is a reference to a narrative that someone is going to already recognize. You can't educate people. You can only trigger something that they already know. Maybe you can say something new in that short time span in that narrative that they recognize to make them think and then look something up and maybe listen to a longer piece of dialogue or monologue or maybe read something. But then generally things and they won't even maybe watch a documentary or even a film anymore. That's why we have, Netflix and people don't go to the movies anymore, right? People want short things even when they're going to sit down. So this is a real big issue. And when I lecture or present or write reports or whatever on this issue with far right paganism and far right views of the pre-Christian past, the question often comes up, well, what is, tell me about this religion. And I try to explain that we're not really dealing with a religion, and even in a religion such as Asatru, even those Asatru pagans themselves are perhaps not always religious in the common sense of that term. So what I try to get across is that the big spectrum of politics and how religious people are is all narratives. We're not really dealing with how religious someone is. Is someone an actual religious fanatic or are they a political extremist? We're just dealing with narratives now. And Stephanie von Schnurbein, who studied neo-paganism, has done some really good work. And it's got kind of overlooked in the study of Old Norse religion and even archaeology and history and people that deal with the Old Norse and Viking material. She made a really good point when she was talking about the way neo-pagans see academia, because they read academia, not all of them, but quite a lot of them, and they try to incorporate that and incorporate that into their practice and their beliefs. And her point was that academics are also kind of reconstructing the old religions. So in many ways, they are scholars of Old Norse religion are kind of doing basically what neo-pagans are doing, and also seem to be completely unaware of the social implications of what they say and what they do and the terms that they use. So, for instance, if you were to constantly use a word like pagan when you're studying Old Norse religion, or use the term Viking, that is going to have connotations on people that, based on their narratives, how they want to read into your material, their ability to think critically, because you're using shorthand terms or you're assuming that people are going to extrapolate a certain meaning out of the term Viking, but it might not. It might have a completely different meaning. And I've tried to have this conversation academically at conferences. So I presented once at a study of Old Norse religion conference, and I tried to really push back against this use of definitions. For instance, like the term Old Norse religion. Well, the religion itself wasn't Old Norse, and it wasn't always in Old Norse, and Old Norse is an invented term. There were no Norsemen, and to use terms like Vikings is also wrong. And this is something that's come up in a lot of your academic guests on the show. The term Viking is problematic, right? So academically, we need to be really careful about what we say, because you're educating and you're leading people down certain paths, and it can also be misinterpreted or misused, misapplied. You can quote someone on the environment, for instance, right? So an environmentalist needs to be careful about what they say, because they might be misquoted by someone who wants to completely subvert the information they're getting across because of the narrative that's out there. So I think there's a lot to be talked about in archaeology and history courses and religion courses when dealing with the past. We need to be much more responsible and careful, because you can't disassociate yourself as an individual and how you interpret this material and your own interests in, why am I interested in Vikings? Why am I interested in the far right and pagans? Why am I interested? I'm talking about myself here. Why am I interested in religion? You know, you have to ask yourself those kinds of questions, because otherwise, for instance, I might be looking at a certain amount of material and I'm trying to find a religious element where there isn't any. You see,
Yeah.
and I think that's one of the problems that we, as because I also have a master's in archaeology and history, you also tend to do that when you're looking at Old Norse material. So you'll look at all the, say, Scandinavians in Ireland, but at what point did they stop becoming Scandinavians and become Irish?
Yeah, exactly.
Or what do we mean when we talk about Irish? Because you're using modern terms, and a lot of that gets coloured by modern national politics, right? So we have to be very, very careful and reconsider the definitions and the terms and the categories we use.
Yeah, I
That's
mean, there's
something.
so much of that going on in the scholarship right now of just the term of like, oh, Vikings capital V, Vikings lowercase v, like, and then when we talked to Leszek Gardella about his book Vikings in Poland a couple of weeks ago, and we mentioned this, and or at least I did, it's like the more I study these people, the less clear they become to me, who I'm actually studying. And so the idea of having to be like, okay, the big part of what you have to sort of do at the beginning of any of your discussions is sort of framing, well, who these people are. And kind of like, I'm losing sight of who these people are. Are they changing on me all the time? I mean, it's interesting just like in looking at your book and talking about these people in terms of looking to this quote unquote pagan period or heathen period. And let's say the Old Norse gods, right? Like CJ was just saying, somebody's getting their Thor's hammer tattoo or somebody's saying I'm an Odinist or whatever. So there's that mythology portion of it. But then there's also the other side of the allure probably of the Viking, which you address a bit in the book as well, of like the warrior aspect of this. And I think that that's interesting. I mean, is it just the Germanic connection or what in your mind? Because there's lots of warriors throughout human history in various cultures in the world, lots of them. So why Vikings, do you think?
Well, yeah, I'd say every society,
Yeah,
has warriors.
yeah. Even
So
now.
yeah, it's almost impossible. Even tribes in the rainforest, they have weapons, whether it's for hunting or for, they will fight each other as well. So to talk specifically about Vikings as warriors, as if Christians didn't have, if that isn't a, as if that isn't a warrior heritage,
Yeah.
it's kind of it's to the point that it's insane, really. We talk about mental gymnastics and rewriting your view of the facts that are staring you in the face to suit your own narrative. The idea of your ancestors being warriors because you've decided your ancestors are Vikings is is pretty impressive. Like I said, pretty impressive mental gymnastics. But I think it goes back to the Romantic nationalist period, not necessarily because of the nationalism or romance of it. It was just basically that the modern world view, our concept of that period of history, almost crystallized in that time and didn't hasn't really got updated too much. So it's not really a problem that they were romantics or nationalists. It was a problem that what do we do when we've just only got this material and we're trying to make sense of it? And then that they came up with an answer. The answer was the Viking warrior, and that hasn't really got updated. So even in the National Museum of Copenhagen, National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, the amount of exhibitions there in the last 5 years that use blatantly ahistorical iconography in order to communicate what the exhibition is about is really astounding, because you could almost say it's misinformation. But the only way, people are walking through town, they've got, Coca-Cola signs and
I want the money.
yeah, you've got Gaza going on and, Christ all knows what. You see something that's an exhibition of, and you see something of a horned helmet, you go, oh, great, I'll take my kid there. That's literally the amount of time you've got to register something. If you have a historically accurate person from that period wearing a woolen cloak and a haircut that you don't recognize, so the one that we have a lot of evidence for is that kind of Norman cut with the fringe at the front and then shaved. If you have a person who looks like that, you're not going to get people going to that exhibition. It's that simple because you're not, people can't recognize that and you're not triggering people's narratives. You're not having an emotional response into them. And everything is driven by emotions, it's not driven by intellectual knowledge. And there's consequences to that.
Yes, I experienced such a consequence when I was, I had someone from the Chateau de Nantes or de Noirmoutier, sorry, who reached out because they're doing an exhibition on representations of Vikings in graphic novels, which was kind of cool. I was like, oh, that's fun. And they were the local historical association recommended to the person organizing the exhibit to reach out to me because I'm known over there for, knowing stuff, and I've given conferences there on Vikings and so forth. So this gal reaches out to me, and she wanted to do the exhibit, and she explained to me what it was, and I thought it was all well, swell and good. It's kind of media representations of Vikings, great. But then she mentioned something about that Assassin's Creed Valhalla game, which I've seen cursory parts of it, and I've never played it, but I can tell you there's really as far as the visuals, there's not a lot in there that's accurate. But they had recently partnered with the Jorvik Viking Museum. And so when I was having a conversation with this guy who's putting on the exhibit at the Chateau Noirmoutier, I just mentioned, I was like, oh, well, Assassin's Creed, oh, that's all anachronistic BS. Like, it's just none of it's bad. Like, we can pick it apart all day long. And she held her ground, and she said, no, it's accurate because the Jorvik Viking Museum says it is. And I was dumbfounded. I was like, wait, what? And she took their word for it over mine and never talked to me again. And I was not involved in that project. And I was absolutely blown away that, okay, so I wanted to bring some kind of authenticity and historicity to the project, but I got laughed out of the room because Jorvik Viking Museum decided to try and make some money by partnering with a fictitious game, and it altered perception. And because of their authority, then that fictional representation becomes truth. There was a study done. I wrote a blog about this a while ago. There's a study done years ago, actually a series of studies, and they all showed the same thing. And it showed that in depictions of the past that are fictionalized, viewers tend to remember the things that are fiction rather than the things that are historically accurate. And this is proven true every time somebody studies this. It comes back the same. So we know that fictional representations alter the public's perception. And so we're playing a very dangerous game there. Anyway, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole where I'm going to get angry. So I'm just going to back off of that for a second.
Well, I find this really interesting because I mean, talking about catch-22s of dealing with history and mediating it. I mean, you're a writer, yeah, and in order to sell your books, you must be thinking about your audience to a point. Even though you're not only writing, I suppose you will write for yourself to a point. You've also got to consider that you want people to enjoy it, not necessarily for financial reasons, but you want people to enjoy your work, and you also want people to recognize the themes and what you're talking about. And you also have a visual element to your book because it has to have a cover and it has to have a name, right? So the name to the book and the cover, it has to trigger certain things that might not necessarily be historically correct, right?
Right.
So what do you do?
Well,
what do you do?
So here's what I do. I'm going to go back here. How long is it? It's really long. Like 30 pages, 40 pages of historical notes. Here's where I stayed true to history. Here's where I went totally off my chair. Fictitious. Every book I do does that. And that's where in my blog I that was my proposal is I think movies, films that come out and purport to be historical should have a mini doc at the end during the credits to explain this is where we stayed true to history, this is where we deviated, because I recognize as a writer that you can't always stay true to history and still tell a good story. Narrative structures demand certain things to unfold, and that doesn't, I have my what I call the historical scaffolding, And I try to weave the story within that, but sometimes I have to change things around, right? Like I did a fur trapper one that took place in 1821. Somebody comes back and says, the fur trapper Manuel Lisa, whom my character meets, died in 1820. I was like, I know, read the historical note. like it just so happened I needed him to meet Manuel Lisa, but he was a year too late. I'm sorry, but it
Well,
makes
but
the story better.
in fairness to you, CJ, though, I mean, your genre is historical fiction, and so
Right, but I still feel like I have a responsibility to inform people. I mean, because also when I like how do I market myself, right? I market myself as somebody with a history degree who teaches history, right? And then also, right. So there's I bring it's kind of like History Channel doing the Vikings. If that TV show Vikings had come out on Cartoon Network, no one would have said, "Oh, look how historically accurate they are." But instead it came out on the History
On the
Channel,
History Channel.
which carries a certain amount of implication. And
oh,
then
the
they were
history
totally
channel.
fictional, right?
Oh,
And so that it's kind of that, right? Like
yeah.
I did a great roundtable in 2017 at the University of Leeds with some fellow authors about how historical should historical fiction be. And we ran the gamut. There's me on the far right of the stage. And I was the one saying, I scaffold with history. I try to stay as true to history as possible, and I do a lengthy historical note at the end of my novels. And then everybody in between kind of was on a spectrum of how close they were. And then all the way on the left side was a gal who did, Vikings and vampires. And with her, it was like, I don't care. It's also implied vampires, we are treading very different territory than CJ Adrian over the far right of the stage, right? I also had a great conversation with Bernard Cornwell after. He didn't get to go to the conference, but I reached out to him after and did an interview for my blog. And he was his perspective is really interesting because he does have historians that review his stuff, and then he does have historical notes that do that where he explains where he deviated. He does that really well in his Sharps Richard Sharp series. And he said his job is to tell a story first and get the history right second. And I really like that he admits that, but also has that structure afterwards to admit where he went off. And so I think if everybody did a better job of that, we would avoid a lot of this. Just like the Jorvik Viking Museum partnering with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, they should have put out probably more messaging of saying, yes, we're doing this because it's interesting. We're exploring modern representations of Vikings in video games. Wonderful. However, here's where it goes off the rails. That way, museum curators in France aren't getting the wrong idea of like, oh, it must be historically accurate, right?
Well, remember last year when we talked to Soren Sindbeck, and he's written critically about museums and
Yeah.
also the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, because it's like, why is there always some sort of Viking exhibit? That's a big deal. And it's like, Denmark has other history. And it's like, yeah, well, I mean, and as some of our listeners know, I might have mentioned this before. I mean, before I became an academic, I got a background in museum work. And it's like, you know, you have to sell tickets. And even Leszek, right, 2 weeks ago was like, why do you call your book Vikings in Poland? Yeah, well, because it is about Vikings in Poland, but also because any title that has the word Vikings in it sells. And, so then there's, you're sort of getting into that sort of reality as well for these institutions. So, I mean, I'm not sort of, giving them an excuse, but that is the reality of it.
But it's narratives again. So like if you say Denmark to someone in Brazil, they don't think about, the Danish imperial period,
Right.
or something like that, which to a lot of Danes, they're very aware of and very proud of that period of their
Right.
history with good reason. And um, so they Danes, it's almost like Danes are synonymous with Vikings. They're not synonymous with bog bodies, of which there's a hell of a lot more material on the Bronze Age in the bog bodies in the museum, National Museum, than there is on the Vikings.
Right.
And it's amazing. Anyone listening got to go to the museum. It's fantastic. It's
Yeah.
such an experience. But again, we're talk about these narratives, right? So in order to communicate something, and that's literally what's happening with neo-pagans, and it's also happening with the far right. They are consuming a narrative, and that's often what leads them into their political or their religious thing. So Viking metal is a big one that turns people on into paganism because they start getting inspired by, music is inspirational, right? Fiction, these narratives are inspirational. And then the Viking metal talks about these gods and stuff like that. So you think, oh, kind of kind of believe in this, or I want to talk to people that maybe there must be people out there who believe it, or they know that there are modern pagans, and then they'll go down that route, right? And they start their journey like that. And there are a lot of people in the heathen community that don't believe in spiritual gods, but they still call themselves heathen. And then we have this question: so is it a religion? Or is it an identity, or is it a narrative? And that's something I always try to communicate when we're talking about security threats around what we call paganism, because it's not really paganism isn't religion in that context. It's just narratives. It's things. It's a language. It's a communication. We communicate signals about identity and what we mean, what we stand for. So, example, in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, you've got units on both sides that quite often, in fact, very, very commonly, use what's called a morale patch. So it's like a rubber sticker. It's like a Velcro, I guess. Do you guys use the word Velcro? They put that normally on their body armor or something like that. And it'll be something to keep morale up, So it could be something funny, something a bit rude, maybe. But quite often it has religious symbols. And on both sides of the conflict, because both have this narrative that they're descended from the Kievan Rus, they use a lot of runes and maybe some kind of Viking religious symbol, or a Viking holding an AK-47 or something like that, right? And when I say Viking, I mean the stereotype of a horned helmet. So it's not a real Viking, but that's what someone sees. And they're communicating that not just to the other guys in their unit, but when they go off duty and they go back to Ukraine or Russia and they're walking around the civilians, they also recognize these things that they're sending off, these signals that they're sending off to each other. But they're also battling over these symbols and their identification, their right to identify with this history to each other, because both units or both factions have the same religion in some cases. So we have the Wagner group. A lot of them were Ravnaveri and heathen, Germanic and Slavic pagans. So we have whole chapters about that in the book. And on the Ukrainian side, we have not least what's now the Azov Brigade, or the Azov movement in general. So you've got literally guys fighting each other in trenches, and they are both involved in what we would call in religious studies terms, when dealing with this kind of material, you would call it cosmic warfare. So this is like really in the same league as talking about jihadists and that kind of stuff, where people's entire identity, their children, their ancestors, so their history and their future, and their politics, their country, everything that they stand for is a cosmic war. It's not a holy war. That's something almost quite marginal. It's about something on a cosmic scale for them, where everything aligns. And it can be signaled in a really stupid, cartoonish way of a horned helmet, bearded guy with a beer belly holding an assault rifle. That can be communicated just in something like that, right? And they do have pagan rituals. There's a lot of data on that. So it's not just like, there's obviously going to be a lot of guys who have this cartoonish stuff that they send out. So it's just an identity, maybe, or just a narrative. But there are guys who have the same part of the same world, the same cosmic war, who do have religious beliefs and will carry out religious rituals like blood sacrifices, animal sacrifices, that kind of thing. So it's serious stuff that goes on.
So I wanted to read, actually, speaking of this kind of identity stuff, when I was reading the introduction to your book, so I was going to read just a couple of passages here because it totally made me where you say, the heathenry and Rodnavari are decentralized, have no canon, trained or vetted clergy, and are made up of schisms or micro denominations. And then you're talking about the threats that some of them pose and saying they are not regional. They are agile, complex in their modus operandi, and tactically avoid detection to thrive by keeping themselves in obscured communications. Their potential targets for violence could be anywhere, but usually involve points and opportunities local to radicalized individuals. And that overall, we can see that despite the occasional crackdown on their networks or individuals, members scatter and regroup under new banners and monikers, yet the methods are effective and are never abandoned. When I read that, I was like, that describes Vikings. Vikings are just, hit, run, by the time you get a force to like sort of try to deal with them, they're gone. We don't know. I mean, Neil Price has written a bit about, the potential for some of the things that we see even in the archaeology, like the filed teeth and things like that. Like potentially these are, symbols or ways of signifying to other people who they are. Almost it sounds like, like gang symbols to me and things like that. But but there's a threat but the threat, part of the threat involves terror because you don't know when they're going to show up. And then, I mean, all of that, the agile or the agility, the fact that, I mean, I think there is, the one difference between maybe what you could call, heathenism or paganism back in that time versus what Christianity brings, which you do highlight in the book as well, is this idea of there's no trained clergy. There's no one book or, something that sort of keeps it kind of checks and balances. I mean, all of that to me, I was like, that's Vikings. So, I mean, the identity with it, it sort of made sense to me when I was reading that. Like these
I think
people
that's
are
probably a coincidence. I don't think
okay.
that's by design. But
Okay.
if there's any common human behavior in there, it's basically guerrilla warfare.
Yeah.
That's why there's also similarities with maybe you could compare Vikings and jihadists in that case, right? Because
Yeah.
you can't put your finger on who the and you maybe you remove the head, so you assassinate a Viking king, and then you have another guy that comes in and unites certain tribes and clans, and then maybe you look at it and you think it's some kind of religious warfare, but then this Viking army has Christians and pagans in. So what, and even Irish, So what do we call it? And we also see that with jihadists, that sometimes you'll have Christian minority groups or in people that we've assumed were jihadis. This is something that we see in the far right now, where we've got so the English Defence League in the UK, they at least at one point had a Sikh religious group. They had a Jewish group. They had a gay queer group. Divisions in the English Defence League, but it looks like the English Defence League is very much against those things. That's the rhetoric, and that's the way they're perceived from the outside. But as I say, at least one point in time, what united Sikhs, British or English hooligans, gay rights activists, and Zionists, or certainly Jewish nationalists, what united them was anti-Muslim or Islamophobia in Britain. And that's why the English Defence League looked really confusing and mixed bag. So that's what's going on today. And I'm not sure if people have directly learned lessons from Vikings, but it's human. What we're dealing with is factionalism,
Yeah.
and humans do what humans do, which is not conform to categories and definitions.
So in the book, you propose some solutions to how to deal with the radicalization, the threats, because we've talked quite a bit about the danger posed and some of the issues that rise from that, etc. But you do have some good recommendations that like you to speak to in terms of how to counterbalance them. Maybe not to remedy everything that's going on, but to at least put in some kind of effort to reduce the incidence of the threats.
Right. Well, that's it's just to preamble this. It's sore point, because basically what we're doing is we're saying to both pagans and to policymakers that this is our interpretation. And when I say our, I'm not just saying me and Karina, but also at least some of the people that contributed chapters to the book. So the organization that, at least under the auspices of the book, which I was associated with doing that, is Inform, who specifically work with religious minorities and trying to mitigate social harms. So the whole point of the book is to be sympathetic to pagans. But my concern is that if any pagans actually read the book and get as far as the conclusion, that they're going to feel some way attacked or negatively criticized. But that's literally why the book was commissioned, in order to inform policy. And when it comes to policy or remedying social harms, that can never be just in the hands of the establishment or the authorities or institutions. It has to also be in the hands of consumers. So consumers of religion or consumers of heritage, consumers of museums, consumers of video games, consumers of books like yours, CJ. It's a two-way street. You can't just blame everything on the sources. So if we were to criticize pagans for not doing enough, that's all good and well, but are they being given the support? And they aren't. They're not being treated like other religious minorities are, certainly in the UK, even though we recently had a national census, and paganism, just on the census data, is showing that it's astronomically expanding as a religious demographic, that at least, or identity. People identify with that religious set of religions. So there has to be more people taking this seriously in order to help the people that are vulnerable, which are the neo-pagans that don't want to be radicalized, and they don't want to be negatively influenced, and they don't want to be misrepresented themselves. But there's also, in the book, and that this information, this feedback is coming from different contributors. It's also coming from the police. It's coming from people who work in security services in Ukraine. It's coming from people working in media. And it's coming from a lot of both mine and Karina's decades of doing field work with pagans of different political stripes, in that there's an innate problem that just doesn't seem to go away, which is they want more than they're able, than the sum of their parts. They want to achieve a situation, for instance, where they'll have temples in cities. They want to be respected and understood. They want to be ideologically safe. They aren't going to do that if there's no consensus, if there's no discussion between them and, say, Christian establishment. Because Christians have a lot of experience of running institutions and being fairly ideologically stable. They're not, it's not like the Catholic Church is not incapable of having problems and corruption and all of that, but they're still fairly, they've survived. Pagans can learn from institutions and from religious groups like Christians. And there are Christian priests that do want to talk to religious groups like pagans and actually help them develop and help them become more resilient from social harms, whether those are social harms from people who are trying to undermine them and appropriate their religion, like the far right, or if it's people that are harming them because they don't understand this pagan religion and the fact that it is very messy, that there is no clergy, there is no canon, there are no temples. Who do you talk to if you're gonna get an authentic voice or an authoritative voice in a pagan religion like Azatur? Who do you talk to? Because if you talk to the head priest in Iceland, he doesn't speak for pagans in Arizona or Brazil or in Liverpool or Glasgow or Oslo or Berlin. So we have real problems in how we're supposed to help pagans. So there needs to be a dialogue, and pagans need to be more open to becoming more institutionalized if they want to be institutionalized.
Isn't that the point for some of them, though, is they don't want to become that which they don't want to be. Right?
Well, it's more a cake and eater, I think.
Yeah.
They do want some things, some of the benefits of being a recognized religion.
Yeah.
So they want funding, they want the ability to have temples, they want to be able to conduct burial rites and weddings and all of that. But they don't want to, they're allergic to Christianity and institutions and priests and training and anything that resembles dogma or doctrine or
Yeah.
orthodoxy or anything like that. They're allergic to that. And that is something that is always going to hold them back unless they come to terms with that.
In an odd way, this reminds me of a story. Well, it's not a story. I mean, it is a story because I'm going to tell it, but I experienced this at a conference where I listened to an academic give a talk about an experience that they had where they were a known, and still are to this day, although I won't say their name, but recognized scholar in Viking studies who was approached by, I think it was a federal prison in one of the states in the United States that had an Odinist, a person there, but I think also, he wasn't the only one. So a little faction or whatever of Odinist believers, I guess, if that's what you say, or practitioners, or no, you have a word for it that you use separately in the book.
I, yeah, adherence.
Adherence, yeah. And so somehow through channels, like through the I can't remember if it was the whoever the sort of religious official is at the prison, like, that works in the warden's office or whatever, you know what I mean? That person who's sort of the liaison for all the various, then, okay, for the Jews, we have this celebration, over here on your holidays and services, and the Christians over here and the Islamists over here and whatever. And well, then, so there's this little group of Odinists, and the guy was tired of being delegitimized and sort of lumped in with, what he considered to be sort of just a little fringy, like the Wiccans over here or whatever, right? And so had reached out to this academic to say, could you come and talk and explain basically Norse mythology and paganism and all of that so that you can tell these people that we are legitimate, just like the Christians and just like the Muslims and just like the Jews, and we deserve to kind of have our own sort of separate thing that is respected, where we get to have our holy days and our services or whatever it happened to be. And the academic politely declined because the person that was contacting them about this was, a fairly dangerous person in federal prison, and was serving a long sentence and such. But just, I mean, what you're saying there, to sort of, it reminded me of that, of like even these people who we would probably, a lot of people would see as very dangerous, very fringy people, but they're even seeking that kind of legitimizing of themselves so that this heathen view can be seen in the same light as those other religions.
Well, that's again where we have this problem with what is religion and what is politics. So in the prison system, and this isn't just in the US, but it's certainly very visible in the US. It's been well known about for a long time. You've got the gang system, right? And that tends to be based around ethnicity. That's just the way it is. And you kind of get that in Europe as well, in the UK. So you will have some people in prisons who are pagan and not Odinist or not folkish and not based on blood and ancestry and that. But the majority, unfortunately, are right wing and heathen. So they'll be using the pagan or the religious element to camouflage or to require rights for themselves. But really, there's an ethnic or perceived ethnic element to that, and that they will have that if their religion is the same as their the way they perceive their blood ancestry. Yeah. So yeah, there are problems with that, and you also have some issues with if you don't have, say, some mainstream inclusive pagans, if you don't have a reliable clergy across countries or across organizations and things, well, then who are you going to ask for authoritative judgments? Well, you might ask an academic,
Mhm.
But there are no academics that recognize, and I know that there are specifically heathens who are academics, who are well-respected scholars in the study of Old Norse religion, who are heathen. Even they are quite uncomfortable with a lot of the what heathenry assumes is reconstructed or even academically informed reconstructed religion. Um, Academics, whether they are heathen or Christian or whatever, you know, there is a big gap between academic knowledge and truth and what is a very emotionally charged um, set of identifications and narratives. And these beliefs and practices are often innovations. And when you look at where they've come from, sometimes they come from the 1970s and a specific group or a specific organization. And perhaps that group was also very political. So there's a lot of uncomfortable truths in specifically in heathenry and Ukrainian and Russian paganisms. So that if they want to protect themselves and if they want to achieve their aims of being a historical revival or a historical reconstruction and getting close to this this historical religion, they need to have a better dialogue with academics. It's absolutely central, fundamental, I'd say.
Well, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, this was really interesting.
Yeah, totally. Very. So what's next for you?
I am working on, well, it's done. It will be published hopefully this year in a journal. It's part of a collection of articles with other scholars where we're looking at disinformation, um, dis using or misusing narratives in religion. And I, along with one of the contributors in the book, um, are focusing on paganisms or neo-paganisms and how those narratives have been weaponized specifically by the Russian state and their relationship with the far right. So we have a lot of data, not just me and my colleague, but there's a lot of data that the Russian state has for a long time been sponsoring anti-immigration political parties and far right movements. And they also like to complicate things when it comes to neo-paganism and narratives about Viking heritage. So they create disinformation, support disinformation, where they will say that they will sponsor headlines that sensationalize that a government or a museum is trying to be woke and can, censor Viking heritage or white heritage. So it's one of the things I'm working on right now. And there are other things that I'm doing that are um, not going to be available to the public, which is supporting UK government policy.
It doesn't sound like it's light. How do you keep
It's pretty stressful.
I,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
pretty stressful.
I hope you have a balanced life in some manner.
It is disturbing material that you work with, and it's
Yeah.
also the side effects of I personally couldn't walk away from this because I feel like I have a duty not only to stop these harms getting out from the far right, but also protect these inclusive pagans who are extremely vulnerable and who are being misunderstood or being abused in some way or influenced or misrepresented. I'd say
Yeah.
comes out quite a lot. So there are a lot of big questions and big responsibilities, which again goes back to this whole thing where if you work in academia or you study at a university and you study the ancient past and Vikings, you have a responsibility on how you channel that information out into the world because it has very real effects. The way we see our past and ourselves and the narratives that we have, the way we see ourselves and the way we talk about the world will shape the future. And often those futures are based on fear, right? The way we look and where we're going in the future, we're scared of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, we hope that as many people as possible read this, and we will put a link to the book in the show notes so people can easily click and get a hold of a copy. Is it everywhere? Is it, do you know, available like all countries mostly?
Yeah, I don't think, well, I should think it's not available in Russia, Belarus, but otherwise I think we're good. All universities should be able to have access to it, definitely,
Yeah,
and libraries and bookstores, and it's available on Amazon, and all of
good.
that kind of thing. And you can order it directly from Bloomsbury. So,
Okay, great. So
yeah.
we'll include all of that. But I mean, thank
But
you
I'm
so
just
much.
happy that at least you guys have read it, and that at least you two have read it. That's the main thing for me. I'm happy with that.
Well, I like it as a, I mean, and it's an edited volume. And so, there's going to be something in there for everybody, hopefully, because you've got a bunch of different contributing scholars that are coming at it from different angles, both the Germanic and the Slavic. So I think, yeah, I think it's a really nice mix, really, really interesting read.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, thanks
Yeah.
again for coming on the show. Absolute
Yeah.
pleasure. This was fun. A
Yeah.
little bit of a
Yeah, it's a
departure from our
pleasure.
usual, so it was great.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, for me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
All right. Well, have a good rest of your day.
Well, it's nighttime here, but
Well,
yeah,
okay.
I'll enjoy it
What's
anyway.
what's
You
left of
guys have a good day.
those little few
Yeah.
hours? You
You
too.
guys have a good day. Thank you
Thanks.
very much for having me on.
You're
Bye
welcome.
bye.
Thank you.